Today is Sunday, 9th June, and today, of course, in much of Europe, the European Union elections, the European Parliament elections are taking place. Over the last few weeks, there have been many sweeping predictions of huge gains by what the European media and some commentators and some European politicians like to refer to as the far right. Some claims have been circulating that the parties of the so-called far right are going to win around a quarter of the seats in the European Parliament. Sort of parties that tend to get called far right by political commentators are indeed nationalist, socially conservative. They often have markedly different views on how to conduct economic policy. Some support free market, laissez-faire economic policies, as, by the way, Nigel Farage does in Britain. Others take a much more interventionist, paternalist approach, as Giorgia Meloni seems to do in Italy. So there are a strange mix of different parties, and, by the way, it also seems to me that talk of a far-right bloc anyway is misplaced, since I get the impression that the parties, leaders of these various parties, don't actually get on very well in many cases with each other. So there have been, for example, long-standing tensions between Giorgia Meloni on the one hand and Marine Le Pen on the other, and I suspect that these tensions, which maybe started over disagreements of policy, have now evolved to the point of actual personal dislike. Anyway, will these parties make this sort of breakthrough it is, that some people are talking about? I am going to remain sceptical until the last result is published. I've heard for many years, many times, in many elections, predictions in the run-up to elections held in Europe that there's going to be a major shift, either to the right or to the left. Opinion polls appear to confirm that that is happening. And then the results come, and things, it turns out, remain very much as they were. And I, for one, would not be surprised if that is the outcome of the vote today. I would add that the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, has been talking about setting up a coalition for peace. He says that if there is a good result for the so-called far right in the European Parliament elections, and if this is combined with a solidifying group of countries, Hungary, Slovakia, under the now recovering Robert Fico, other countries as well, in Europe, which also seek a more stable relationship, a more peaceful relationship with Russia. And if this is all capped with the victory for Donald Trump in the presidential elections in the United States in November, then that might result in a fundamental change of course, a shift in direction. Well, it's possible, but I would certainly not place any money on it, not based on the previous experience that I have lived through. Anyway, we will see what the results of these elections are. I would say again that if you want me to give an endorsement of any particular political leaders in Europe who are standing in the European Parliament elections, my endorsements go to Mick Wallace and Claire Daly in Ireland, standing for election there. They, of course, emphatically are not part of the far right. People who refer to parties on the right, these various parties, routinely as far right, would call Mick Wallace and Claire Daly far left. though in fact they are absolute conventional left of the sort that I remember from earlier periods of my life. But they have been outstanding independent voices in the European Parliament, calling for all the traditional causes that left-wing parties used to call for, and also, of course, standing for peace, for a peaceful resolution of the crisis in Ukraine and in Europe generally, and also in the Middle East and in other places. Those two courageous MPs, they I do endorse. I'm not going to talk about any of the others. Anyway, there we are. Let's move on and discuss the events of today. Well, the first thing to say is that today, being Sunday perhaps, we've either had very little news, or the news that we have had from the Ukrainian fronts, to be precise, is, well, if not momentous, at the very least, very important indeed. And that is that there are rumours circulating this morning, and I stress that for the moment they are only rumours, that the Russians have now gained control of the entire micro-district east of the aqueduct in Chasov Yar. Now, when I say that, of course, I do understand that talking about the capture of a housing estate, which is what this is, as a momentous event, might be overstating things. In fact, it undoubtedly is overstating things. But nonetheless, it does seem to me that the capture of this complex, this housing district, it's sometimes referred to as the canal complex, though it lies east of what most emphatically is not a canal, but rather an aqueduct. Anyway, the capture of this district would be of fundamental significance in terms of the overall development of the battle, the fight for Chasov Yar. And, well, just as at the end of last year, in October and November of last year, when the Battle of Avdiivka began, there was a small slew of articles which appeared in the Western media, which acknowledged that the fall of Avdiivka would be a major strategic blow for Ukraine, and the subsequent fall of Ocheretino, an even greater one. Well, we had at some point previously, in the previous few months, a similar admission about Chasov Yar. If Chasov Yar falls, then that opens the way to the much bigger town of Konstantinovka, further to the west. Chasov Yar occupies the high ground. It overlooks Konstantinovka. Konstantinovka is probably undefendable without Chasov Yar, without Ukrainian control of Chasov Yar. If Konstantinovka falls, and if some other small towns nearby also fall, which they presumably would do, following the fall of Konstantinovka, the only remaining important town, or rather city, in this area is Kramatorsk, which is the biggest city still controlled by Ukraine in Donbass, and which forms the southern spur of the Donbass-Slavyansk conurbation. So it would be very, very big news. In fact, if you look at a map and if you undertake some creative interpretation of the map, you could see that following the fall of Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka, it might potentially be possible for the Russian army to advance all the way to the Dnieper without even needing to capture Kramatorsk first. Though for multiple reasons, I personally think it is most unlikely that that is what the Russians would do. Anyway, it will be, a decisive battle. It would bring to fruition the victory that the Russians achieved last year when the Wagner organization captured Bakhmut. Bakhmut has opened the way to Chasov Yar. Chasov Yar opens the way to Konstantinovka. Konstantinovka opens the way to Kramatorsk. The fall of Kramatorsk would be the decisive defeat for Ukraine in Donbass. After the fall of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, the Russians can drive on, advance, without much in their way, all the way up to the Dnieper. And I've discussed in many programs how the arrival in force of the Russian army on the Dnieper in central Ukraine would probably be a terminal blow for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian state as we have known it. So, if this dramatic sequence of events is actually going to be triggered by the capture of a small micro-district to the east of an aqueduct in the Chasov Yar area, then it would indeed be a major event. And if the reports that I'm seeing this morning are true, then this major event has now happened. Now, having said that, I want to make it very clear that I'm not absolutely sure that these reports are true. What we were learning yesterday is that the Ukrainians have pulled out of the eastern and central parts of this micro-district. As of yesterday, or at least as of yesterday evening, the Ukrainians still were holding on to some buildings in the western part of this micro-district. And I would have thought that given the importance of the micro-district, and by the way, given the difficulties of retreating across the aqueduct to Chasov Yar itself, I would have thought that the Ukrainians would want to stay in these buildings, at least for some days, if only in order to try to get some kind of defences organised west of the aqueduct in Chasov Yar itself. But it is possible that things overnight have moved further and faster, that Ukrainian resistance in this area has crumbled faster than the Russians maybe anticipated, and that there was a perhaps disorganized retreat by the Ukrainian forces to the west side of the aqueduct from the western part of the micro-district. One way or the other, this battle for the micro-district is now coming to an end. It may be that the Ukrainians will try and cling on to these buildings, as I said, for some more time, but it can only be now a question of days rather than weeks. Weeks, if it is weeks, it'll be weeks at most before the Russians finally and completely clear the micro-district. And there is convincing evidence, at least as far as I'm concerned, that the Russians are now entrenched south and north of Chasov Yar, west of the aqueduct, on the flanks of Chasov Yar itself. So, if so, were the Russians to the east, holding positions to the east, right on the aqueduct itself, and were the Russians holding positions to the north and south, and with the roads, the supply roads into Chasov Yar, exposed to attacks by Russian artillery and Russian drones, and perhaps even from time to time attacks by Russian raiding parties, the supply situation in Chasov Yar would become critical. The Russians would be able to launch attacks on Chasov Yar from multiple directions, and Chasov Yar itself, the battle for Chasov Yar, would probably, the end of it probably would be within sight. So, anyway, that's the news we got this morning. We'll just have to wait and see whether or not it is correct. Elsewhere on the battlefronts, it is in some respects more of the same, except that the situation in Kharkiv region appears to be again shifting back towards in Russian favour. Now, I say that we've had lots of talk and speculation and rumours over the last couple of days, at least that the Ukrainians were planning some kind of major counterattack in the Kharkiv area. About a day or so ago, they did launch some kind of a counterattack in the Lipsy area, trying to recapture a village called Gluboka. Apparently 2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, or at least one definite Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, participated in this attack. According to the Russians, the number of Ukrainian troops who involved themselves in this attack was just 30, not the 100 I thought it might be in the programme yesterday. And since then, well, things from the Ukrainian side seem to have petered out. It looks as if the promised offensive, the one that we all expected to come, well, for the moment at least, it's not materialised. Maybe if this attack was a reconnaissance in force, the Ukrainians concluded that the Russian positions in Gluboka and Lipsy were just too strong, and that the Ukrainian forces would not be able to break through. Or alternatively, it may be that the destruction of another bridge that the Russians have made in this general area, and about which Group of Forces North has been bragging on its website, that has indeed interfered with Ukrainian logistics, causing the Ukrainians to put off their counteroffensive. Or it could be that the major program that the Russians have been undertaking of destroying Ukrainian artillery and missile positions in this area has taken its toll, and that this is what has prevented the Ukrainians from launching this counterattack. Or it could be that the Ukrainians are simply husbanding their strength, adjusting their plans, and that the offensive will come at some point over the next couple of days. Again, we will have to wait and see. I have made known my own clear view about this counteroffensive. I think it is an extremely bad idea. About 2 weeks ago, we were getting reports from the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian Army that there was no Ukrainian plan to try to defend either Volchansk or Lipsy, much less counterattack in that area, but rather to pull back to better defended positions closer to Kharkiv itself, the positions the Ukrainian army used to defend Kharkiv in the spring and summer and early autumn of 2022. Well, that was what the 79th Brigade said. We've been hearing about counteroffensives ever since, and the Ukrainians fighting to retain their positions in Lipsy and Volchansk. But certainly I think that a counter-offensive into the teeth of the Russian army, with Russia's major armoured reserves, its armoured infantry and its tanks still not committed to the battle, I think this would be a terrible idea. And to add further to things, there's been some pictures circulating, films circulating, of some of the Ukrainian troops in the Kharkiv area perhaps training for this counteroffensive. And I found it a deeply upsetting sight. They were, to put it generously, exhausted and frightened looking old men. Now, we've been hearing a great deal about the recent mobilization drive that Ukraine has been undertaking, and there's been a lot of comment about how the Ukrainians have reduced the age level for mobilization from 27 to 25, so that it is apparently that demographic of younger people is the one that supposedly, if you read all the reports and all the media reports, it is that demographic allegedly which is being targeted. And, well, it's been commented by many people. Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama wrote about this extensively back last year, that this demographic is very small, and that recruiting these young people, these young men, into the Ukrainian military will deepen the extremely severe demographic crisis that Ukraine is already experiencing. And for that reason alone is something that Ukraine should not do. Well, if we judge from these pictures, and they may not be entirely representative of the mobilization that is taking place, it looks as if the Ukrainian army, perhaps because there are relatively few young men, perhaps because those younger men in Ukraine who might be called up have either already left the country or are in hiding somewhere. Anyway, it looks as if, at least in some units, the people who are actually being mobilized are the very old and the ones who, let's put it this way, don't look in particularly good shape or health, because all of these men that I saw in these pictures looked to be in their 60s, and they looked tired, and they looked ill, and they didn't look at all comfortable or happy in their uniforms. If that is indeed the state of the Ukrainian army at the moment, then I completely understand all of this cascade of reports that's been pouring out of Ukraine, at least and specifically from the Ukrainian army itself, and which has been picked up by media outlets in the West, primarily in the United States, about how the Ukrainian army is very unhappy with the new recruits that it is receiving, that they're not only badly trained, but that they're not physically up to the business of fighting. And, well, these pictures would indeed confirm that. Anyway, it was actually an upsetting thing to see. Of course, it's only one set of pictures and films. It may be that this was a unique unit with particularly old cohort of soldiers. It may be that other units have fitter and healthier men. But anyway, it did reinforce the many misgivings about the mobilization process which I have had. I am still, I should say, appalled at the thought that any government or group of governments would decide to send men in the kind of condition that I saw in these films into battle to essentially end their lives. Anyway, there we are. So far, no offensive, no Ukrainian counterattack, and it is still the Russians who are, by their own account, by the accounts of group of forces north, it is the Russians who continue their offensive in Kharkiv region. Now, this is not a dramatic offensive like the one we saw in the first days and fortnight of the offensive, when the Russians crossed the border, found that there were no fortifications or minefields there to speak of, occupied dozens of villages practically without a blow, and marched all the way to Lipsy and Volchansk, where finally they encountered Ukrainian resistance. It's not a battle like that, it's not an offensive like that, but it is an offensive in which the Russians are still advancing against obviously much stronger Ukrainian resistance, and it is an offensive in which the Russians are able to exact very, very heavy losses on the Ukrainians. Now, the Russians claim, or rather to be more precise, Group of Forces North claims that it is indeed advancing in the fields to the east of Lipsy in what looks like some kind of an outflanking maneuver. Again, I'm not going to pretend I understand the tactics, but anyway, they do seem to be advancing in that direction. And they have been making further claims of further advances within Volchansk. They say that their forces in the eastern part of Volchansk have advanced further, and that within the industrial district, just below the so-called citadel, the high-rise complex in the center of Volchansk, this is Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, in this industrial area, they've captured several more buildings in the major factory, which they need to capture, with analysts, for example, those at Redovka, claiming that if the Russians are able to capture the factory buildings that they're fighting for, then the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers in the high-rise buildings will indeed be well and truly trapped, and that their collapse, their defeat, will follow, and will follow relatively fast. So that is what the Group of Forces North tell us. They also are claiming, by the way, that their forces in Volchansk have advanced a further 300 meters, which would suggest that by now, much of northern Volchansk, most of northern Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, must indeed be under their control. So, that's the news this morning from that part of the battlefronts. Everywhere else, it's much the same. It's the Russians continuing their advances. Now, yesterday I said that in the Avdiivka-Ocheretino area, we were getting reports that the Russians had captured the village of Sokol to the west of Ocheretino. There's been no confirmation of this, but it does seem very likely. And there are apparently now pictures showing the current situation in the much bigger and much more important village of Novo-Alexandrovka, also west of Ocheretino, but north of Sokol. And it looks as if the Russians may now be in control of around 70% of this village, and might be on the brink of capturing the remainder of it. Now, that village, if it is indeed captured, it's going to be another important event, not perhaps on the scale of the capture of the micro-district west of the aqueduct in Chasov Yar, or the earlier captures of Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Ocheretino, but nonetheless an important capture, bringing the Russians very close to one of the main supply roads used by the Ukrainian army in Donbass, and of course with the Russians also advancing to the southwest through the village of Karlovka. They're also getting ever closer to the major supply bases used by the Ukrainians, the logistics centers used by the Ukrainians in Donbass, places like Pokrovsk, Selidovo, and other places. So it does look as if, again, the Russians are advancing there. And there are also reports that they're advancing northeast of Ocheretino and north of Arkhangelskoye, and towards another village in that area, Kalinovot, if my memory serves me correctly. And it looks as if once Novo Alexandrovka and Sokol and these other places are captured, and this Russian breakthrough area has been consolidated, the Russians will be in a position to pivot northeastwards, which apparently is their plan, and to take the Ukrainian forces west of Gorlovka, in places like New York and Toretsk, to attack them in the rear, and perhaps, if Chasov Yar falls, some point in the next few weeks, to link up with the Russian forces pushing southwest from Chasov Yar, and taking in Konstantinovka along the way, bringing together, merging, in other words, the Russian front lines, but doing so in a way that brings the Russians much closer to the Dnieper and escalates the threat to places like Kramatorsk and others. So, altogether, continued progress by the Russians across the battlefronts. There's also been reports that the Russians have made further advances in Krasnogorovka, that they're apparently entering a park area in that city, place which the Ukrainians still control. Unlikely, I would have thought, that the Ukrainians would be able to defend themselves very long in that kind of place. But anyway, that the Russians are moving towards entering it, and that the Russians also making significant progress in the other place, the other Konstantinovka, the village, the small village this time, west of Novo-Mikhailovka and Paraskovyevka, which they captured a few days ago. And according to the Russians have not actually, contrary to what the 79th Brigade has been telling us, they've not actually physically entered this village, but that fighting is indeed taking place on its outskirts. So, Russian offensive continues. In fact, in some respects, it is gaining momentum, and a Ukrainian attack or counterattack, if it was really intended, has not so far materialized. Well, maybe because we're now in the weekend, we've had less of the terrifying rhetoric from the West that we have been getting over the last couple of weeks. Macron and Biden have had a meeting. The meeting, my sense is, looking at the way in which the two behaved with each other, probably didn't go especially well. There were no important new announcements, just as there weren't any announcements from the French when Macron and Zelensky were in communion with each other a few days ago. But it looks, for example, as if the American plan to seize Russian assets, including even the interest on the Russian assets, that there's been no progress so far on this. The opposition of the lawyers and of the banking community in Europe, and the declared opposition to this plan of the government of Hungary, which, by the way, is about to assume the chairmanship of the European Union. Well, it seems that all of this is delaying this plan and is infuriating the Americans, and seems to have acted as a problem over the course of these discussions. What we have had from the Americans is a series of statements which seem to be going out of their way to reassure American opinion and world opinion that the United States does not intend to get drawn into a military confrontation with Russia in Ukraine. The Americans, including the President himself, have been saying that it would not be in American interest to do that the United States does not want to be involved in some kind of World War III type situation with the Russians in Ukraine, and that in all of the circumstances, the United States is doing everything it can to assist Ukraine to defend itself, but Ukraine cannot expect the United States to defend Ukraine for it. I am going to make a guess that the administration has recently undertaken some private polling, and that the polling on this has come back extremely negative from American respondents to whether there should be a deeper American involvement in Ukraine. And given that the president is at the moment tied up in an election campaign where there have been increasing doubts expressed, apparently, within the Democratic Party about whether he is the right man to be standing at all, just saying. Well, in light of all of that, I think that the administration, for the moment, has decided that it is in its electoral interests to dial things down to the extent that it can, and to play down the possibility of direct US involvement in the war. That is my own guess. So it looks as if at the moment things are becoming calmer rather than fiercer. But of course, if things change, if the administration is re-elected in November, for example, well, things could pivot back and we could have more frightening rhetoric and dangerous decisions of the kind that we've seen in the past. As of France, I've had a rather interesting email from a, well, let's call him somebody who has had a NATO background. And also, by the way, let's also call him for what he is, somebody who knows very much what he's talking about. Anyway, this person has discussed the question of the Mirage 2000s, the ones that Macron is now proposing to send to Ukraine. The first thing is that this person is deeply skeptical about the proposal to send, to train pilots to operate these complex aircraft within just a few months so that they can be fielded in Ukraine by the end of the year. He acknowledges that they are aircraft capable of launching the Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles, but he says that it is far-fetched to think that the F-16s couldn't be adapted to do the same as well, and this person thinks that it would not take a particularly long time and would not be that complicated. What he also says is that from his knowledge, and he has a great deal of knowledge, not so much maybe of this aircraft, but of other French aircraft, specifically its successors, what he says is that the Mirage 2000, like all French fighter jets, is designed so that it has no interoperability with American aircraft whatsoever. As he put it, there isn't a single screw in this aircraft. Well, he isn't speaking of this aircraft precisely, but there isn't a single screw in the French aircraft that he knows that is American. And French aircraft are designed that way. The reason is that France builds aircraft, fighter jets, heavily, to a great extent, for export. They are a major French export. And of course, the French, when they export their fighters, they want all of the maintenance and supply for those fighters to be carried out by companies in France. They do not want to sell Mirage 2000s, say, to one of the Arab states, only for the Americans to take over their maintenance and to cut the French out. So these aircraft, these Mirage fighters, would require a completely different, a completely separate logistical chain from the F-16s, one which would be wholly independent of the F-16s and which would be independent of the US and which would be wholly dependent upon France. Now, as this person says, given the problems that Ukraine is already experiencing with this hodgepodge of weapons it's been receiving from all sorts of Western countries, the sort of Frankenstein character of the Ukrainian equipment, army equipment that Ukraine's army now has, the already massively overcomplexed and overloaded logistical and infrastructure chains that this is causing, inserting an enormously complex machine like the Mirage 2000 onto this already overburdened logistical system makes absolutely no sense at all. The correspondent has even suggested that if Macron really had wanted to help, it might have been more helpful for him, for France, simply to acquire some F-16s and to supply them to Ukraine instead, F-16s from third parties, and to simply supply them to Ukraine instead. And what this person is saying is very consistent with that article I read in the Daily Telegraph about the Mirage 2000 delivery, and explains why other countries, other NATO countries like Britain, for example, seem to be very, very unhappy with this decision of Macron. Far from assisting Ukraine, it's only going to create a whole new set of problems over and above and on top of all of the other problems that Ukraine is struggling with at the present time. It is, of course, very like Macron. It's exactly the sort of thing he likes to do. He is somebody who has a compulsive need to strike a pose. Obviously, for him, acquiring F-16 fighter jets from third parties and sending them to Ukraine would be an unacceptable humiliation both for him and for France. So the Ukrainians must therefore have Mirage 2000 fighters, which are superfluous to their current needs and which would only create further problems. It enables Macron to gain headlines, to strike a pose, to appear the strongman president in advance of the European Parliament elections, which we are seeing take place today. And that is what is more important to him, seemingly, than the realities, the actual battlefield realities in Ukraine. And, well, his idea of sending instructors, trainers to Ukraine itself to train the French military, the Ukrainian military, that also appears to be encountering pushback from various sources. So I've been reading today in the American media, I think it was in Bloomberg, that Germany is now straightforwardly opposed to the idea of sending trainers, instructors, to train the Ukrainian army in Ukraine itself. the Germans have basically responded negatively to this idea. Italy is doing the same, so is Austria, and so, I understand, are Britain and the United States. And I get the sense that the French Defence Ministry isn't hugely keen on this idea either. A couple of days ago, back on Friday in fact, Macron was talking about the French trainers training a new Ukrainian brigade of 4,800 men. And I certainly came away with the impression that this brigade was going to be trained in Ukraine itself. But it turns out not. The French defense minister says that it will be trained in France. So what exactly are these trainers, these instructors that we're told Macron has already sent to Ukraine? What exactly is it that these people are meant to do? Of course, the reality is that they're not instructors at all. They are French military, previously sent by Macron to Ukraine as part of his plan to establish a military presence, an open French military presence in Ukraine. The Western countries were most unhappy about that. The other Western countries were very unhappy about that. The Russians reacted very negatively. The French, after the French ambassador was called in and given a dressing down by the Russian Foreign Ministry, the French pretended that there were none of their troops in Ukraine at all, even though there obviously were. And, well, the French, having been caught out, are now trying to somehow adjust things by acknowledging that their troops are in Ukraine after all, but calling them instructors. That, it seems to me, is what this is all about. We see here the actual folly of the way in which Macron conducts this diplomacy. He has been instrumental over the last few months in increasing tensions between Russia and the West to extremely dangerous levels. But his actual moves, the things he has in fact done up to this point, have either been neutered by Russian opposition or by Western skepticism and have proved ineffective. So his idea to send thousands of troops to Ukraine didn't meet with approval from his NATO partners, resulted in criticisms, well, in threats from the Russians, and it has all had to be toned down and repackaged with the fiction that these are instructors. His plans, which he seems to have been instrumental in driving, for deep missile strikes into Russia, have resulted in a softening of the Western stance. The United States now is allowing cross-border strikes in the Kharkiv area, strikes which, by the way, have achieved nothing in military terms, just saying. But the proposal for deep strikes on Russia with missiles, that has been ruled out. And the Mirage supply to Ukraine, that has left the Ukrainians themselves unenthusiastic. I can actually clearly remember Yuri Ignat, the former spokesman of the Ukrainian Air Force, actually, this was some months ago, actually saying that Ukraine did not need or want Mirage 2000s. It had decided to go with the F-16s. It did not want the complication or need the complication of adopting two completely different aircraft like the Mirage 2000 and the F-16 at one and the same time. I remember that thing which Yuri Ignat said only after I got that email from that correspondent, that member of the Duran community. Anyway, this plan to supply Mirage 2000s, far from having been greeted with enthusiasm, either by the Ukrainians or by Macron's NATO allies, appears to have annoyed them all. Well, I don't expect Macron to change. He seems to be consumed at the moment with an overwhelming desire to avenge himself on Putin for some slight or other. I have no idea what it is that's driving him. I've already explained why I think a anger towards Putin because of what has happened to the French position in West Africa makes absolutely no sense at all. It shifts the blame onto Putin and the Russians for decisions made by the Africans themselves. It could be that something else has happened which we don't fully know about, that Putin hasn't been answering Macron's calls, for example. I'm not sure. But anyway, it seems that Macron is consumed with this need to injure Putin in some way, and also with a further need to attract attention. And so he's been coming up with these dangerous plans and terrible schemes, which for the moment have not been translated into practical action. Now, that is not to say that the situation does not remain extremely dangerous. There's been an extremely interesting interview which the British historian Jeff Roberts, who we have been fortunate enough to host on the Duran, Glenn Deason and myself, and whom I'm expecting that we will have again very soon. Anyway, he's given a very interesting interview. You can find it, I think, somewhere on YouTube. But in it, he made the point that the reality is that despite various claims that have been made, the Western powers simply do not have the military resources to reverse the outcome of the war in Ukraine, the way in which the Russians are winning the war. Even their conventional forces, if they were fully committed, even if the US forces were fully committed, they would not be sufficient to win a victory over the Russians. Now, the last is controversial. I continue to receive a steady series of claims, especially from one person, that the Western powers, and the United States in particular, has a supposedly overwhelming advantage over the Russians in air power, and that if there was an all-out war, or rather an all-out aerial offensive by the Western powers against the Russians in Ukraine, the Russians would be quickly overwhelmed, their air force would be shot out of their skies, and their air defense system would be destroyed in a matter of days. Now, I have to say, I've had the contrary view expressed to me by all sorts of people, that on the contrary, it would be an enormously difficult operation, fraught with tremendous risks, which quite probably would not succeed in the teeth of the Russian Air Force and air defense system, and that the commentators who insist that the Americans would sweep the board in aerial combat are greatly overestimating American air power and underestimating Russian. Well, I am not going to get into that discussion, which I'm not remotely in a position to adjudicate myself. I would say that the skeptics of American air power, seem to me to have much stronger credentials and backgrounds in this area. Many of them are Air Force people, former Air Force people, than those who appear to think that the Americans would sweep the board here. But anyway, the point is that I think Jeff Roberts is right. You can't anyway just win a war with air power alone. The Russian army is far more powerful, far bigger, far more powerful, far better equipped now than any combination of NATO armies. And if NATO were to send troops to Ukraine, almost certainly they would be defeated by the Russians, and probably quite quickly, because were that to happen, what Putin was talking about, which I discussed yesterday, that the Russians might choose to accelerate their tempo, that might actually happen. We would start to see the gloves come off and the Russians start to do things which they have not been prepared to do up to now, like shooting down Western surveillance drones, shooting down AWACS aircraft, perhaps interfering with satellites in a systematic way, perhaps destroying Western satellites in a systematic way, perhaps doing all kinds of things that I lack the knowledge, the basic knowledge to imagine. So, given that this is so, that in itself creates enormous risks, because if Ukraine is going down to defeat, and if the West knows that it cannot reverse that, and or if the West makes the disastrous mistake of committing forces to Ukraine to prevent Ukraine's defeat and to defeat the Russians, and is at that point defeated itself, then the danger that the Western powers, that it might be the Western powers who decide to resort to nuclear weapons, becomes enormously real and incredibly dangerous. Now, for my part, I not only agree with Jeff Roberts, I'm going to say this. If there is an all-out war in Ukraine between NATO and Russia, I think it would be impossible to contain it within Ukrainian borders. I am sure that each side would inevitably start to take action beyond Ukraine and strike at the installations, the major military installations of the other. The Russians, of course, have already said as much. And it seems to me that the Russians have far more in the way of long-range striking power with their hypersonic missiles and such things than at the moment the Westerners do. But of course the Westerners might respond, and probably would respond, with an all-out aerial campaign, though it is difficult to see how that, if it were successful, would stop at the Russian border, and if it were unsuccessful, it is likely that the Russians would anyway feel that they would have to move and destroy Western air bases in Europe itself. I cannot imagine that in such a catastrophic, cataclysmic scenario, nuclear weapons would not be used. Sooner or later, in fact, definitely sooner, probably within days of all of this beginning, unless it were very quickly brought to a stop, we would have a situation of some kind of nuclear exchange taking place. Even if everything were brought to a stop at that point, if there was an exchange of nuclear weapons and then immediately a ceasefire, which is not impossible, well, the taboo against the use of nuclear weapons that has prevailed since their first use in August 1945 against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have been broken, and the probability that nuclear weapons would be used again fairly soon in some conflict or other around the world will have been massively increased. So, it's still an incredibly dangerous, reckless game that is being played. Yet we come back to the reason why Macron has been able to make the weather to the extent that he has. Because even though the Western powers must at some level be aware of the enormous risks they would be running if they were to conduct some kind of further escalation in Ukraine, the option for negotiations is still one that is excluded. And in fact, the rhetoric remains incredibly, dangerously strong. Now, here I don't just mean the endless ritual claims that Vladimir Putin is the reincarnation of the German Chancellor who committed suicide in Berlin in 1945, or that Vladimir Putin is being driven by some kind of massive Russian imperialist itch, which would require him, once Ukraine was subjugated, to march all the way through Western Europe, presumably to the English Channel, and who knows, even beyond that. Put all that aside. Consider instead the constant rhetoric about the fact that Ukraine must win, that a defeat for the West, or a defeat of Ukraine, would be a defeat, a major geopolitical defeat for the West. Chancellor Scholz was up to that, was doing that again just a day or so ago. He was talking about how Ukraine will never fall, that President Putin of Russia needs to understand this, and that the only acceptable outcome, therefore, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but the only acceptable outcome, therefore, is some form of Ukrainian victory. This is the language, the rhetoric that Chancellor Scholz is using. Now, that is unattainable. That is unachievable without these terrible risks that we've just been speaking about, that Jeff Roberts has been speaking about, being incurred. So the logical thing to do is to drop this rhetoric and to explore negotiations. Now, Putin still says that he's interested in something that could be defined as Istanbul Plus. It might not be easy to agree, but that's what Putin is saying. But we don't want to we in the West do not want to negotiate with the Russians at all. Istanbul Plus is not part of the agenda. We're trying to help the Ukrainians by diplomatic tricks and sleights of hand, such as the Lucerne conference in a week's time, one which has already effectively failed. But anyway, we are proposing to do something like that. That, as I said, achieves nothing. It just moves the dial closer to the point of an eventual Ukrainian collapse. And given the enormous stakes, the enormous prestige that the West has now invested in a Ukrainian victory, how does the West respond if a total Ukrainian defeat looms? Do they simply accept it and walk away as they did in Afghanistan? Or do they themselves escalate in some fashion? Now, I come back to that terrible, haunting film of these aged and decrepit Ukrainian soldiers looking shabby and exhausted on the training fields, weighed down by their helmets in their uniforms. If this is the true condition of the Ukrainian army, then a Ukrainian military collapse, may not be so far off. It's impossible to predict exactly when it would come. But as I have said on many previous occasions, attrition wars have a habit of ending suddenly. A good example is the First World War, where it seemed as if on the Western Front, neither side was able to make a breakthrough until the summer of 1918, when first the Germans launched what turned out to be an unsuccessful offensive, and then the Allies launched an offensive of their own, which appeared to be having rather more success. However, though the Allies were making significant progress, anyone who was observing the situation from a distance and looking at maps might not have noticed that the entire German military system was in a state of crisis. But in fact it was. And in the autumn of 1918, the German government, the emperor, his government, the entire military system, basically all imploded at once, including, by the way, the army on the front lines, whose ability to keep fighting, it is now clear, was exhausted. And in November 1918, to the intense bitterness of some Germans, the Germans found that they had no real option but to agree to an armistice, because both on the front lines and domestically, the situation was spiraling out of control. Now, Ukraine is in a similar situation. Its economy is also contracting. The mobilization is depriving factories of workers, especially including of irreplaceable skilled workers. The electricity system is is in a state of collapse, with talk about blackouts. The farmers apparently are only expecting to bring in a much smaller crop this year because of the massive disruptions that the war is now causing. The population is disaffected and exhausted. There are question marks over the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government following the cancellation of the presidential elections. And the army, all across the front lines, is overextended and overstretched and extremely exhausted. And, well, we see the kind of men that the mobilization is providing to replenish the ranks. Now, it seems to me that the conditions for a collapse are there. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen tomorrow or even at all. You might find some courageous people going on fighting right up to the very end, fighting all the way to Galicia, across the Dnieper, for example. There may be elements of that, but it seems to me a more likely outcome is that we will suddenly see, at some point along the front lines, a sudden collapse. And I discussed how the form that collapse might take in previous programs. I mentioned how, for example, another attrition war, the American Civil War, also ended in a sudden collapse in March 1865, with the decision by General Lee to capitulate to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. This, even as hundreds of thousands of Confederate troops remained in uniform on the battlefronts across many other theatres. Anyway, Lee's surrender led to a rapid cascade effect, so that within a few weeks Confederate resistance had all but collapsed? Well, that possibility, that kind of scenario now exists. Now, I'm going to make an informed guess, which is also something of a prediction, which is that I think that the Russians are probably not counting on such an outcome, but that they are aware of its possibility and that they are probably preparing for when it happens. Putin spoke in St. Petersburg that situations might arise which might cause the Russians to hurry. If there's a sudden collapse by the Ukrainians along the front lines, creating a potential vacuum in large areas of Ukraine, then I can see that the Russians might decide at that point that they need to advance faster and to push their forces further west across the Dnieper and in other places in order to prevent a dangerous power vacuum from emerging, and one which the Western powers sought to fill. Does the West have any analogous plans of its own? Well, some are interpreting this plan for land corridors, the military Schengen in Europe, as a possible such plan. I can't say I think so myself. It doesn't look to me as if that is the case. We haven't seen the hundreds of thousands of troops being deployed to Europe that would be needed to translate that into action. But anyway, some kind of plan in the West to prepare for a military collapse, a Ukrainian collapse, would seem to me to be the very minimum that the situation calls for. Better still, negotiate now before such a collapse takes place. Now, going back again to the start of the program, capture of a micro-district, a housing estate, to the west of Chasov Yar, east of Chasov Yar. Not, perhaps, a vast event in itself, but avalanches can start, as everyone knows, with the dislodgement of small pebbles. This fall of the micro-district, if it's happened, could be one. We might, over the next few weeks, start to see Ukrainian positions in Chasov Yar, Konstantinovka, perhaps even Kramatorsk, in Toretsk and New York and all of these other places, and Volchansk and who knows where. They might all start to fall like a row of dominoes. Or it could be that the Russians will capitalize on the exhaustion of Ukrainian reserves and the apparent withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region to begin operations of their own on the west bank of the Dnieper. It's been Dima at the Military Summary Channel yesterday spoke about the fact that the Russians have now started FPV drone attacks on Ukrainian positions in Kherson city on the West Bank, and that is something that we have not seen at any time since the Russians withdrew from Kherson city to the east bank of the Dnieper back in the autumn of 2022. So it could be that the Russians will push across the Dnieper and reoccupy Kherson city, perhaps without resistance. That would be a massive psychological blow for Ukraine. Or perhaps the Russians are preparing an offensive in Sumy region. There is endless discussion and debate about this. A couple of days ago, the Ukrainians withdrew, evacuated some border villages in this area where they still expect a Russian offensive to take place. Well, any one of these things could act as the trigger for something unexpected. And the creation in Ukraine of a vacuum in a crisis where the stakes have been raised so high might in itself be very dangerous indeed. It might be the most dangerous point of all in the entire crisis. Of course, better to prevent that happening at all, like, for example, by beginning negotiations. But at the very least, would it not be a good idea to establish communications with the Russians so as to at least know what the Russians might do in the event that a situation like that were to arise? Also, might it not be a good plan to develop plans for the rapid evacuation of Western personnel and diplomats from Ukraine, including from Kiev itself, if a crisis of that kind were to take place? I've already discussed this in previous programs, but it seems to me that nothing has been done. Well, that's what the points that I'm going to be making today. Maybe I'm drawing too many conclusions from one video, but I suspect the pictures of those Ukrainian soldiers will stay with me. Of course, it's not impossible that this was all done for show, to mislead the Russians about the state of the Ukrainian army. Perhaps, as I said, this was an untypical unit. But anyway, it triggered all of these thoughts, and I think that they are thoughts which Western governments, if they were acting responsibly, ought to be taking heed of. I get the very strong impression that Western governments still do not understand fully the true extent of what is happening in Ukraine. They're still living in a false universe where Ukraine is holding its own, keeping the Russians at bay, because the Russians didn't cross the border and seize Kharkiv. There's talk, for example, that the situation on the border has somehow stabilized, which, as I said, is a complete misunderstanding of events, not just in Kharkiv, but across the entire battlefronts generally. There still seem to be, as I said, fantastic ideas that a couple of more shells, a few more fighter jets are going to change the situation, which I don't think they will. But no one seems to be prepared to address or think about these other scenarios that I've just been talking about today. Anyway, one way or the other, that film will stay with me, and it makes me feel even more concerned about the importance of bringing this war to an end as soon as possible. No one at that kind of age should be forced to fight in the way that those Ukrainian men I saw in that film apparently are being forced to do. Now, I'm going to finish this program with one very last thing. Yesterday, the Ukrainians carried out a number of drone attacks on Russian air bases, including the major Russian air base at Aktyubinsk. And the Ukrainians have made claims that over the course of this attack, they destroyed a Sukhoi 57 fifth generation stealth fighter jet of the Russian Air Force. And they've provided photographs which certainly show, as far as I can see, a Sukhoi 57, though they're very smudged. I am unable to see any difference between the fighter jet as it was before the attack allegedly took place and as it is after the attack allegedly took place. There appear to be some dark patches in the later photograph around that aircraft. I'm not sure what they mean. Perhaps they mean that there was debris there, but from a falling drone. The Russians, by the way, claim that they intercepted all the drones, though they do acknowledge that some debris did fall and cause damage. But anyway, I'm not sure what these dark patches mean. And of course, it's not impossible that some retouching of the photograph has been done, or that we're looking at light and shade effects. But assuming that there was a drone attack and that a drone did get through and that some damage to the Sukhoi 57 really was done, even if it is repairable, which some in Russia are saying, well, why was a valuable fighter jet like that on a runway vulnerable to this kind of attack at this stage in the war? Now, there's been a lot of discussion and commentary in Russia and in the West about the ongoing purge in the Russian Defense Ministry. All sorts of corrupt and incompetent people have been sacked, and some of them are being arrested and are facing prosecutions on various corruption charges. I wonder myself whether the failure to sort out the need to set up hardened shelters in Russian air bases within drone range attack of the conflict zone is not one. I suspect that creating hardened shelters is quite a complex and time-consuming task, but then the Russians were able to create massive fortified lines in Ukraine in the autumn and winter of 2022-2023. Certainly creating hardened air shelters that would provide protection for their fighter jets cannot be a task beyond them. I am sure that the real reason this has not happened is because of the usual bureaucratic arguments and obstacles and things of that kind. And I do wonder whether someone in the Kremlin, maybe VVP himself, has finally had enough and come to the conclusion that there's been far too much foot dragging over this issue for far too long, and it's time to clear up the people who are responsible for it from the Defence Ministry, and whether this might have been one of the things that triggered the decision to put a tough new manager in charge, Andrei Belousov, with perhaps instructions finally to sort it out. Anyway, a last piece of speculation from me. Let this be the point where today's video ends. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where we're selling Football 24 t-shirts and other things. I believe there's a discount as well. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.